Our scripture reading today is from the book of Proverbs, chapter 12. Beginning in verse 1. Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid. A good man obtains favor from the Lord, but a man of evil devices he condemns. No one is established by wickedness, but the root of the righteous will never be moved. An excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who brings shame is like rottenness in his bones. The thoughts of the righteous are just, the counsels of the wicked are deceitful. The words of the wicked lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright delivers them. The wicked are overthrown and are no more, but the house of the righteous will stand. A man is condemned according to his good sense, but one of twisted mind is despised. Better to be lowly and have a servant than play the great man and lack bread. Whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. Whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthless pursuits lacks sense. Whoever is wicked covets the spoil of evildoers, but the root of the righteous bears fruit. An evil man is ensnared by the transgression of his lips, but the righteous escapes from trouble. From the fruit of his mouth a man is satisfied with good, and the work of a man's hand comes back to him. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. The vexation of a fool is known at once, but the prudent ignores an insult. Whoever speaks the truth gives honest evidence, but a false witness utters deceit. There is one whose rash words are like a sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. Deceit is in the heart of those who despise evil, but those who plan peace have joy. No ill befalls the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. A prudent man conceals knowledge, but the heart of fools proclaims folly. The hand of the diligent will rule, while the slothful will be put to forced labor. Anxiety in a man's heart weighs him down, but a good word makes him glad. One who is righteous is a guide to his neighbor, but the way of the wicked leads them astray. Whoever is slothful will not roast his game, but the diligent man will get precious wealth. In the path of righteousness is life, and in its pathway there is no death.
Well, thank you, Clara. Well, this morning we are continuing our sermon series in the book of Proverbs, and we come to Proverbs chapter 12. And as you can tell just from what Clara read, Proverbs is kind of a unique book, isn't it? We got through Romans as the sermon series we preached on before Proverbs. Romans is nothing like Proverbs. Proverbs is nothing like Romans. In Proverbs here, there are over 800 of these short little, memorable, pithy little statements of wisdom that address like about every area of our lives. And because of that, like if we're not careful, we can read through a chapter like this and all these different proverbs, and we can kind of read them, like let's be honest, we can kind of read them like a fortune cookie, right? Or we can kind of read them just kind of as humorous little statements. We can kind of read them as helpful advice. We can kind of read them as ancient wisdom that was given to us a long, long, long time ago by this great king by the name of Solomon. And the only problem is, like, and let's be honest, that's the temptation, I think. Like, I feel that temptation at times. But the only problem is that when we begin to read Proverbs like that, we forget where all these Proverbs came from. Like, we forget who ultimately spoke and gave us all these Proverbs. That these Proverbs ultimately came from the mouth of God. Like think about that, right? they came from the all-powerful, all-knowing, unchanging, infinitely holy, perfectly wise, completely sovereign, eternal creator of the universe. Like each and every one of these proverbs, like over all 800 of them, came from his mouth. They're his wisdom to us. And they can be trusted, right? Like we've talked about this over and over again, that if God is the perfectly wise, all-knowing creator God of the universe, then that means that God created everything according to his perfect design, and therefore he knows how everything in this world is to operate. He knows how everything in this world is to function. He knows how everything in this world is to work. That just like a designer maybe built an engine for a car and designed an engine for a car, he put that engine together according to his design because he knows how it's supposed to function. He knows how it's supposed to operate. He knows how it's supposed to work. And so God did the same exact thing when he created marriage. He knows exactly how marriage is to function and exactly how marriage is to work. God created money. He knows exactly how money is to be used, how money is to be handled. God created speech. He created emotions. He created friendships. He created parenting. He created everything. And because of that, God and God alone knows how all these things are to work and how they're to function because he created them and he designed them. And because of that, then it only makes sense, right? That we're to listen to the designer. We're to listen to the creator. We're to listen to his wisdom in all these areas. And when we do that, then what happens is that they function properly. We flourish in them as we live according to his wisdom, as he designed all these areas of life. But the opposite is true as well. When we don't live according to his wisdom and his design in all these areas, and instead when we live according to our own wisdom and we do what is right in our eyes in all these areas, then they don't function like they were supposed to. They don't operate and work like they're supposed to. And instead we experience brokenness like we just sung and Zach just prayed about. We experience pain. We experience difficulty and heartache in relationships and parenting and our financial lives and our emotions and all these areas of life because we're trying to operate in all these areas of lives of our life in ways that God never designed them to operate. We're trying to live in these areas outside of his wisdom. And because of that, that's why it's so important and imperative that when we come to these Proverbs, we don't just view them as fortune cookies. We don't view these Proverbs as just some helpful advice or ancient wisdom from a long time ago. Instead, it's imperative that we view these Proverbs as wisdom from an infinitely holy, perfectly wise creator God of the universe who knows how all these areas are to properly function and work. And because of that, then it only makes sense that we don't listen to our own wisdom and the world's wisdom, but we submit ourselves to God's wisdom in all these areas. And that's my hope as we come to chapter 12 here this morning. That in chapter 12, if you notice here, this is God's wisdom to us on like a whole host of topics. Do you notice that? A whole host of topics. Like choosing a spouse to marry, work, our speech, our words, how we talk and communicate with others, how we should respond to the advice and the counsel that others give to us, pursuing righteousness. Like these are all the different topics, all the different subject matters that God is going to give us wisdom on in this chapter here this morning. And so then in some ways, like this sermon, because of the nature of this chapter, it's gonna feel like 5 little mini sermons as we deal with 5 of these different major topics within this chapter this morning. At the same time, though, as we look at these 5 different topics, within this passage this morning. What we're going to see is these are all like really practical areas of our lives that we encounter each and every day. Like each and every day, we all work in some capacity, right? Some in vocational jobs, some at home, but we all work in some capacity. And because of that, like we need God's wisdom when it comes to how we're to work. We all talk, we all communicate, we all speak, like every day. And because of that, we need God's wisdom in terms of how to use our words and how to talk, how to communicate, how to speak to one another. Each and every day, we're faced with temptation and decisions about righteousness and wickedness, and therefore we need God's wisdom when it comes to pursuing righteousness. Most days, we all have people in our lives who are giving us advice, who are giving us counsel, or even correcting us. And so we need God's wisdom in terms of how to respond to correction, how to respond to advice, how to respond to the counsel that others speak into our lives and give to us. There's a number of singles within our church here, many who are contemplating marriage at some point in their life. And so they need God's wisdom when it comes to selecting and choosing someone to marry. And so then that's what we're going to see within this chapter this morning. We're going to see these 5, what I would call just words of wisdom from God when it comes to all these different practical areas of our lives that we encounter each and every day. Not fortune cookies, not helpful advice, but the sovereign creator God of the universe speaking his wisdom to us in these specific areas that he designed himself. And so he knows how they're supposed to properly function. And when we live according to his wisdom, then we will flourish. When we don't, we'll experience brokenness and pain. And so here's the first piece of wisdom God gives to us in this chapter. It's this. You see this on your handout there. It's to humbly listen to the advice and correction of others. Humbly listen to the advice and correction of others. This first piece of wisdom God gives us, and we see it in the very first proverb there in verse 1. Look there with me. God says, "Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid." So that's the S word, right? That we don't use in our house and we don't use in the church very often, but it's in the Bible, okay? So he's contrasting, so I can say it. So he's contrasting 2 different groups here, right? He's contrasting those, catch this, who love to be corrected and those who hate to be corrected. Like that's what the words here, discipline and reproof, mean in verse 1 there. The words discipline and reproof both mean correction. And so then the reason that the one loves correction is because they love knowledge. They love correction because they love knowledge. That word knowledge in Proverbs is pretty much synonymous with wisdom. That wisdom is applied knowledge. And so then the reason that he loves correction and being corrected is because he loves knowledge. He loves wisdom. In other words, he loves being corrected because correction helps him grow in wisdom. Correction helps him, when others correct him, it helps him grow in wisdom. It helps him grow in maturing and living according to God's wisdom. And so then put all that together, right? If you love wisdom, if you love growing in God's wisdom, if you love growing and living according to God's wisdom, then you'll love to be corrected. You'll love for people to correct you. You'll love correction because correction is one of the ways in which sin will be exposed in your life, and it will be exposed, areas of your life will be exposed in which you're not living according to God's wisdom. And so correction then fuels righteousness. Correction fuels growing in wisdom because it reveals your blind spots in which you're not living according to God's wisdom. But the opposite is true. If you hate correction, like think about you, right? If you get defensive and upset and passive aggressive when people point out things that you're doing wrong and point out things in your life in which you need to be corrected in, then verse 1 says that you are stupid. You're dumb. You're a fool. And the reason you're stupid is because, again, correction is one of the ways in which we grow in wisdom and become wise. And so then if you hate correction, then you're shutting yourself off from one of the primary ways in which God wants to make you wise. And if you do that, then you're stupid. And he makes a very similar point a few verses later in verse 15. Look there with me. Verse 15 says that the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. And so then again, Solomon here is contrasting two different types of people here. He's contrasting those who are fools with those who are wise. And he's saying that those who are wise listen to the advice of others, while those who are fools don't listen to the advice of others. And the reason that fools don't listen to the advice of others is because they believe that they're right in their own eyes. And since they're right in their own eyes, then they don't need to listen to the advice of others. They don't need the counsel of the advice of others because in their mind, they're already right in their own eyes. So then let's get really practical and personal for a minute, right? Like, be honest, which of these best describes you? Like going back to verse 1. When someone corrects you, what's your initial response? How do you respond? Are you one of those people who make it easy for others to correct you? Because they know that when they come to correct you, that you'll listen to them. You'll humbly receive their correction. Or are they hesitant to come and correct you because they know that you're going to get defensive? They know that you're going to get upset. They know that you're going to get all passive-aggressive on them when you seek to correct them. Or going to verse 15, right? When you're faced with an important decision in your life, when you're wrestling with an important issue in your life, do you seek the counsel of others? Do you seek the advice of others? Or are you too proud to seek the counsel of others and seek the advice of others because in your mind, you don't really need it because you're wise in your own eyes? When others speak into your life and give you advice and give you counsel, do you listen to it? Do you humbly receive it? Or do you just do what you want to do because you're wise and you got everything figured out? In verse 1 and verse 15 here, God is saying, this is God's wisdom. This isn't a fortune cookie. This is God, His wisdom. He's saying that it's wise, it's smart to humbly listen to and humbly receive the advice and the correction of others when they speak into your life. That's first piece of wisdom. Second word of wisdom God gives us in this chapter is this. It's to faithfully pursue righteousness, not wickedness. Faithfully pursue righteousness, not wickedness. Like, this is a huge theme, probably the main theme that we see all throughout chapter 12. And one of the main ways that Solomon seeks to highlight and emphasize this theme is by showing the consequences of those who walk in righteousness in contrast to those who walk in wickedness. He shows the consequences, the end result, the outcome of those who walk in righteousness and those who walk in wickedness. And we see these consequences repeated in different ways over and over again throughout chapter 12 here. And you see these on your handout as well. The first consequence that Solomon mentions is that the righteous, they obtain favor from the Lord, while the wicked are condemned by the Lord. That's what he says in verse 2. Look at verse 2 with me. He says, a good man, meaning within context here, a righteous man, a good man is a righteous man, obtains favor from the Lord. But a man of evil devices, meaning a wicked man, he condemns, meaning the Lord condemns. The second consequence he mentions then, you see this on your handout, is that the righteous will be secure and safe from God's judgment, while the wicked will be overthrown. This is what we see in the very next verse. Look at verse 3. It says that no one is established by wickedness, but the root of the righteous will never be moved. We see a very similar truth if you skip down to verse 7. Look at verse 7 with me. Verse 7 says, the wicked are overthrown and are no more, but the house of the righteous will stand. In all likelihood, what these two verses mean, verse 3 and verse 7, what they're referring to is what will happen to the righteous and the wicked on the day of God's judgment. That on the day of God's judgment, when God comes to condemn and judge, on that day, the righteous will be safe and secure, while the wicked will be no more. They'll be overthrown. They'll be judged. They'll be destroyed. Third consequence that Solomon mentions between the righteous and the wicked then is this. It's that the righteous are condemned by others, while the wicked are despised by others. We see this in the very next verse there in verse 8. Look at verse 8 with me. It says, a man is not condemned. I said condemned. That's not good. Verse 8 says, y'all need to correct me. Like, come on. Verse 8 says, a man is commended. There we go. A man is commended according to his good sense. And so this is referring to a wise and righteous man. He's commended according to his good sense because he lives according to wisdom and righteousness. So he's commended by others. He's commended, right? Not condemned. But one, verse 8, but one of twisted mind, meaning the wicked man, is despised. And so this proverb here, right, verse 8, this isn't always true, right? Instead, this is generally true. Like, generally speaking, if a person is wise, if a person has good sense, if a person is righteous, if a person lives according to God's wisdom, then he'll be respected and commended by others. But if a person has a twisted mind, if he's wicked, then he'll be despised by and looked down by others. Again, that's not always true, but Proverbs aren't meant to be always true. They're meant to be generally true. So verse 8 is generally true. The next consequence then we see between the righteous and the wicked is this. It's that the lives of the righteous escape trouble, while the lives of the wicked are filled with trouble. We see this kind of near the end of chapter 12 or verse 21. Look there with me. Verse 21 says, no ill befalls the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble. And so then again, this is generally true. This isn't always true. There are many exceptions to this proverb here, like Job. But again, this proverb is generally true. That if you live a wicked life, and so if you go around murdering people, if you go around stealing from people, if you go around doing all sorts of evil and wicked against people, then your life is going to be filled with trouble. That is generally true. You'll probably go to jail. You'll have all sorts of financial problems. You'll alienate yourself from people. Your life will be filled with trouble. But if you live a righteous life, then you'll escape many of the troubles that the wicked person is going to bring upon themselves. And so this proverb and the consequences of verse 21 are generally true for the righteous and the wicked. The final consequence Solomon mentions then is this. It's that the path of righteousness, the path of righteousness leads to life, while the path of wickedness leads to death. It's the last consequence he mentions at the very last verse there in verse 28. Look there with me. Solomon says, in the path of righteousness is life, and in its pathway there is no death. So then we've seen this path language, right? These two paths all throughout the book of Proverbs. There's the path of righteousness that leads to life. There's the path of wickedness that leads to death. That's the consequence of those who are righteous and those who are wicked. One leads to life, one leads to death. And so these are the consequences between those who walk in righteousness and those who walk in wickedness. The consequences of those who walk in righteousness are this. The consequences of those who walk in wickedness are this. And so then, here's the point for why Solomon is highlighting the consequences between those who walk in righteousness and those who walk in wickedness. The reason he emphasizes these consequences is for this reason. If you're here this morning and you're knowingly and willingly living in sin right now, And that's what Proverbs 12 means by wickedness. You're living in rebellion against God, and you're not living according to God's wisdom, and you're not living according to God's commands. If you're living in sin, if you're living in evil and wickedness, then hear this. What you're doing right now isn't just sin. What you're doing right now isn't just rebelling against God. What you're doing right now, it's not just evil, it's not just wicked. Instead, in light of the consequences that we've just seen, what you're doing right now isn't smart. It's just not smart. It's dumb. If it's true that the path of the righteous leads here and the path of the wicked leads here, then it's not smart to be on the path of the wicked. It's just not evil to be on that path. It's just not wicked to be on that path. It's just not sin to be on that path. It's just not rebellion to be on that path. It's not smart to be on that path. And so for the sake of wisdom, forsake your wickedness and pursue the path of righteousness. Again, that's just not a fortune cookie telling you that. Like, that's the wisdom of God telling you that. Third piece of wisdom God gives us then is this. It's to carefully choose whom you marry. Carefully choose whom you marry. So then, remember real quick, who Solomon, the father, is writing these Proverbs to. He's writing them to his young, unmarried sons. That's who he's writing to. And so then in verse 4 of chapter 12, he tells his son about the importance of a wife. And he tells his son about the effect, for good or bad, that a wife can have on her husband. And so then look at the wisdom Solomon gives his son when it comes to a wife in verse 4. He tells him that an excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who brings shame is like rottenness in his bones. And so then, that word at the very beginning of verse 4, that word excellent there literally means strength. It means to be strong. And within the context here, it's probably a reference to the wife's strong character. That's why some translations translate the words excellent wife here as a wife of noble character. Her character is strong. Her character is noble. As we'll see in Proverbs chapter 31, she's a virtuous woman. And as a result of her strong character and noble character, she's the crown of her husband. Don't you love that imagery? She's the crown of her husband. Meaning, because of her character and her noble character, she brings honor, she brings dignity to her husband. In contrast to that, though, the rest of verse 4 says that the wife who doesn't have noble character, she brings shame to her husband. And as a result of that, she's not a crown to her husband. Instead, she's like rottenness to his bones. Meaning her shameful character, her shameful behavior makes her husband feel like he's rotting away and wasting away on the inside. And so then, that's the power that a wife, that a spouse can have on her husband. That's the power, that's the effect that a spouse can have on his wife. And so do you know what this means then for a young, unmarried son that Solomon is writing to? It means that he better be careful whom he marries. And the same is true for those who are single and considering marriage here this morning. Like, whatever you do, please hear this. This isn't This isn't my wisdom, this is God's wisdom. Whatever you do, don't choose a spouse simply based on how cute they are or how beautiful they are. Like, don't choose a spouse based upon feelings and emotions and how they make you feel. Like, don't choose a spouse based on compatibility and how well you just seem to click and get along and how much you just seem to have in common. And don't choose a spouse based on fear because you're afraid you might be single and alone the rest of your life. Instead, primarily choose a spouse based on character, based on noble character, which then begs this question. Well, how do I determine that? Like, how do you determine the character of a potential spouse before you marry them? Well, here's how you don't determine that. I'm serious. Here's how not to determine that. Don't look at their character when they're with you. Don't look at their character and how they treat you when you're dating. Flush all of that down the toilet. Everybody with me? That's true. Like, not all the time, but the majority of time. And so if that's true, then how in the world do you determine the real character of someone that you're interested in marrying? 3 ways. You ready? The first way is this. How do they treat their mom? I'm dead serious. How do they treat their parents? Do they honor their parents? Do they obey their parents? Do they live in submission to their parents? Are they overly dependent upon their parents? How do they treat their parents? You want to know their real character? Look at how they treat their mom and look at how they treat their dad. Secondly, you want to know their real character? Look at their relationships in the church. Are they a meaningful member of a church? Do they live in mutual accountability with other members of a church body? Do they actively and intentionally take responsibility for the spiritual growth and spiritual well-being of others within the church body? Are there others within the church in which they're discipling, they're investing in, they're hosting, being hospitable to, having them in their home, pouring their life into? Are they sacrificially serving others in ministry? You want to know their real character? Look at their relationships within the church. And you want to know their real character? Look at their relationship with Jesus. Do they have a heart that burns for Jesus? Do they have a heart that hungers for Jesus? Do they have a heart that lives for the glory of Jesus above anything and everything else in this life? If so, then they'll spend regular time with Jesus in the Word. If so, they'll spend regular time in prayer each and every day. They'll confess sin. They'll fight sin. They'll pursue holiness. That's how you determine the real character of somebody. Their parents, the church, and Jesus. Those are 3 practical ways. That's God's wisdom. Be careful. Whom you marry, whoever that person is, can have powerful effects on your life. It can either be a crown of honor, or it can be like rottenness to your bones and make you feel like you're living a living hell and nightmare that will never end. Over the last 6 months, I've had 3 guys call me that I've known for 20 plus years who are in horrible, horrific marriage relationships. Before they ever got married, I and other guys told them, don't get married. Don't marry this specific person. Don't do it. Wait. They did it anyway. 20 years later, they're calling me, and they're in tears, weeping like a little baby, and just have no earthly idea what to do. Life is horrific. Be careful. Use wisdom, God's wisdom, when it comes to whom you marry. 4th piece of wisdom is this. Diligently work hard and don't be lazy. Diligently work hard and don't be lazy. I guess that this is probably a fourth way to determine a real character, somebody too. But anyway, we see this fourth piece of wisdom repeated 4 different times within chapter 12 here. The first time we see it is in verse 11. Look there with me. Verse 11 says, "Whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthless pursuits lacks sense." So that makes sense, doesn't it? Like if somebody works hard, they get up every day, they work their land, then they're going to have plenty to eat and plenty of bread and plenty to show for it. But instead, a person is lazy, they stay in bed all day, they play video games all day, they binge watch Netflix, they scroll through their phone all day, they don't go work the land, they're not going to have anything to eat. See a similar truth repeated a few verses later in verse 14. Verse 14 says, "For in the fruit of his mouth a man is satisfied with good, and the work of a man's hand comes back to him." In other words, work is kind of like a boomerang. Like if you work hard, then the fruit of your work will come back to you, and you'll be able to enjoy the fruit of your labor. But if you don't work hard, then you're not going to have anything to enjoy. Look down at verse 24 then. Verse 24 says that the hand of the diligent will rule, while the slothful will be put to forced labor. So again, this isn't always true, but generally speaking, those who are diligent, those who work hard, they're promoted. Right? They're given more responsibility. They're given oversight to lead and manage and rule over others. While those who are lazy, they just become a servant of others. Look down at verse 27 then. "Whoever is slothful will not roast his game, but the diligent man will get precious wealth." And again, that makes sense, right? If you're lazy, if you're slothful, then you won't have any meat to eat. You won't have any meat to roast because you've just been lazy and laying around all day, so you didn't go out and get your meat to roast. Those who are diligent, though, those who work hard, then because of their hard work, they make money, they earn money, and gain precious wealth. And so the whole point of those Proverbs, right, it's pretty common sense. Show us wisdom. God's wisdom. God's wisdom says, work hard. It's wise to work hard. It's wise to be diligent. It's foolish to be lazy. It's foolish to waste your time on trivial things, on unimportant things that don't ultimately matter. Those who are wise and diligent work hard. They'll have something to show for it. They'll be rewarded for it. While those who are foolish and lazy won't have anything to show for it and won't be rewarded for it. So it's smart, it's wise to work hard and not to be lazy. Fifth and final piece of wisdom Solomon gives us is this. It's to carefully select the words you speak. Carefully select the words you speak. And again, we've talked about this already in Proverbs, and we're going to talk about this a whole lot more in Proverbs. Proverbs has a lot to say about the mouth, has a lot to say about the tongue, and the words that we speak. And so we're going to be talking about this a lot. But here in chapter 12, Solomon gives us 2 important words of wisdom or reminders when it comes to our tongue and our speech and the words we say. And the first reminder is this, see it on your handout there, is that your words, our words, have the power to help or the power to hurt others. Words have the power to help or the power to hurt others. We see this most clearly in verse 18. Look at verse 18 with me. It says, "There is one whose rash words are like sword thrust, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. So what he's picturing here and emphasizing here is just how powerful our words are. Our words can either thrust someone like a sword, or our words can bring healing to somebody. And so then I remember when Amy and I were dating in college, we were at Chili's one night for dinner. And I don't remember what I said. It's probably some thoughtless, sarcastic, rash comment. But I still to this day remember looking in her eyes after I said whatever I said. And you would have thought that I'd grabbed the sharpest, longest sword imaginable and had shoved that thing right in her heart. I mean, her face just went white. Her eyes just opened up. Her mouth just, you would have thought she was literally about to kill over. She gets up, runs straight to the bathroom at Chili's. And I still, this day, 30 minutes later, she finally comes back. I still, this day, remember the waitress coming by and filling up my water and asking me if I needed anything and if everything was okay. Because she witnessed all this, And it was at that point in time that I was reminded of the power of words. And how the words that we speak, the effect of the words that we speak can have on people. And that the words that most often thrust people like a sword, according to verse 18, are rash words, right? Meaning they're thoughtless. Meaning we say them before we even think about what to say. And so we've heard this before, the old saying that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's a lie. That's not true. Like, words hurt. Like, there are things that a parent has said to you, 35 years ago, that you still remember, and that still hurt. And that's how powerful words are. They cut deep. They cause a lot of pain. They cause a lot of damage. And that's especially true of rash, thoughtless words that we say without thinking. At the same time, though, the words of the wise here in verse 18, so the one who gives some careful thought, some consideration to the words that they speak, those words from the wise, they bring healing. Meaning they help, they serve, they benefit, they build up others. So then think about this, right, with you. Which of these most characterize your words and the words that you speak? How would others around you, your spouse, your kids, your coworkers, your roommates, your friends, your parents, how would they characterize your words and the words you speak? Do you think before you speak? Are your words rash? Are your words thoughtless? Would your kids, would your parents, would your roommates, your coworkers, your friends, your whoever else say that your words are like a sword? Or would they say that your words bring healing? The second reminder Solomon gives us about words is this. He reminds us that lying lips deceive others and are detestable to the Lord. Lying lips deceive others and are detestable to the Lord. We're not going to spend much time here, but see this repeated 3 different times within this chapter. First time is in verse 17. He says, whoever speaks the truth gives honest evidence, but a false witness utters deceit. We see it again in verse 19. Truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. See it in verse 22. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. Again, 3 Proverbs here, verse 17, verse 19, verse 22, all revealing the foolishness of lying lips. In verse 22, he uses the word abomination. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. That word abomination means detestable. It means the Lord hates it. It means it's repulsive in his sight. Like that's how God feels about lying lips. But he says those who are truthful, meaning those who are faithful, those who speak the truth, he says they're his delight. So then, I know all of that is a lot, right? Like 5 mini sermons packed into one sermon. But those are 5 words of wisdom that God gives to us here about all these different practical areas of our lives. And again, the point that I want us to see here is that these 5 words of wisdom aren't just little words of wisdom that we would read from a fortune cookie. They're not just little helpful advice and counsel that we can hear and we can be like, oh yeah, I'll consider that. I'll take or leave that. Instead, this is wisdom. These are 5 words of wisdom from the all-powerful, all-knowing, creator all-wise, sovereign, eternal God of the universe. And because of that, then humility and wisdom would behoove us then to listen to His wisdom and to submit our lives to His wisdom. But let's be honest for a moment. We haven't always done that, have we? Instead, many times as we look at these 5 different words of wisdom and areas that God addresses in our lives here in chapter 12, if we were honest, many times we've lived according to our own wisdom rather than God's wisdom in these areas. And so then many times, instead of humbly listening to, let's be honest, and receiving the advice and correction of others, in our pride we've shut our ears and gotten defensive and upset instead. And instead of faithfully pursuing righteousness, let's be honest, we faithfully pursued wickedness instead. And instead of choosing a spouse wisely, let's be honest, you've chosen someone that simply just makes you feel good instead. Instead of diligently working hard, you've worshiped comfort and laziness instead. And instead of carefully selecting your words, you've spoken rashly. You've thrust others with the sword of your mouth, and you've lied to them instead. And because of that, do you know what that means? It means if you've ever slipped up at one time in any of these areas and neglected God's wisdom and lived like a fool in these areas instead, then that means you deserve the consequences that the wicked fool deserves in this chapter. You deserve to be condemned. You deserve to be overthrown. You deserve to be destroyed. You deserve to die. This is what we deserve for living like the fool and for rejecting God's words of wisdom that we've seen in this chapter. But here's the good news. This is the exact reason for why Jesus came. That Jesus came to receive all the consequences that we deserve for rejecting God's wisdom in these 5 areas. He received them. Instead of us receiving these consequences, Jesus came and received these consequences. Instead of us being condemned, Jesus was condemned. Instead of us being overthrown, Jesus was overthrown. Instead of us being destroyed, Jesus was destroyed. Instead of us receiving death, Jesus received death in our place. But not only that, like it gets even better. Jesus didn't just receive the consequences we deserve for neglecting God's wisdom in all these areas. He also came to live the perfectly wise life that we couldn't live in all 5 of these areas. In other words, He never once pursued wickedness. He never once lived like a fool. He was never once lazy and slothful. He never once spoke a rash word and lied and thrust people with His words like a sword. Instead, He perfectly lived according to God's wisdom in these 5 areas and all other areas, 100% perfect all the time. And in so doing, He now serves as our representative. He serves as the representative for all those who would trust in Him by faith. And since He's our representative, then God considers us having done what Jesus did. In other words, since Jesus lived the perfectly wise and righteous life, then God counts us as righteous, not because we're righteous, but God counts us as righteous because Jesus is righteous, and He's our representative. Oh, this is important here. This isn't true of everyone in this room. Like, I know that's all good news, but it's not true of everyone in this room. Instead, it's only true for those who trust in Jesus by faith and look to Him as their one and only hope for being rescued from the consequences they deserve for living like a fool and neglecting and rejecting God's wisdom in these 5 areas. Like, this is the hope right here that these 5 words of wisdom ultimately point us to this morning. They ultimately point us to our need for Jesus. But here's here's the kicker in all this. When we recognize our need for Jesus and we come to trust in Him as our one and only hope for being counted as wise and being counted as righteous in God's sight, then the reality of what He's done for us has dramatic, practical effects on our lives, particularly in these 5 areas. It humbles us and keeps us from thinking that we're right in our own eyes. And thereby it causes us to humbly listen to the advice and the correction of others. Not only that, but it causes us then to detest wickedness, because we've seen the consequences of wickedness that Jesus had to absorb for us in our place. And instead it compels us and causes us to pursue righteousness instead. In Jesus' work on the cross in our place, it causes us not to choose a spouse based upon shallow, superficial reasons, and instead causes us to choose a spouse that loves and resembles Jesus. And it causes us to be diligent and work hard and not be lazy and comfortable and live for ourselves, because Jesus worked hard for us and lived for us and didn't live for Himself. And it causes us to use our words not to thrust others like a sword, but to use our words to heal others, because that's what Jesus has done for us. And now, as undeserving recipients of His grace and of His mercy, it compels us to live our lives in radically different ways than the wisdom of the world around us. It completely transforms our work ethic. It completely transforms the words that we speak. It completely transforms who we choose as a spouse. It completely transforms whether or not we pursue righteousness or wickedness. And it completely transforms how we receive the correction and the advice and the counsel of others. That's what Jesus has done, and that's what Jesus can do for you if you come to Him and trust Him as your only hope for being counted as righteous before an infinitely holy God. Let me pray for us. Lord, thank you for today. And thank you for your word. Thank you for how you, even though that you are the creator, glorious, majestic God of the universe, how you speak into the very practical areas of our lives. You're not a detached God who simply just created this world and wiped your hands clean of it and just let it run its course. But Lord, you speak your wisdom into the everyday decisions and struggles and situations and issues of our lives, down to the specific words that we speak. And so, God, I pray that you would help us to see the wisdom in following your wisdom and the stupidity of neglecting your wisdom and how foolish that is. And God, the only way that we can see that is through Jesus. And so, God, I pray, Lord, that these Proverbs don't cause us to leave here just trying to do better. Yeah, we need to do better. But I pray these Proverbs would help us to see, man, we don't measure up. But Jesus has. And He's our hope. We're banking everything on Him. He's our representative. And that we would look to Him and receive the grace and the mercy that has come from Him. And that would radically alter and change and transform how we live in all these other areas of life. And that we would grow more and more and mature more and more every day in living according to your wisdom in these areas. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.